Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. Thanks to everyone for joining us for this conversation examining the national security implications of the 2020 election. Well, we have a decision, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will take office in January, replacing the Trump administration. It's harder to think of a sharper contrast between two candidates than Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And the Biden team has already signaled its intent to change the current U.S. approach to some key issues like COVID and climate change and American alliances and Iran and international organizations. But of course, there's a large number of uncertainties, starting with the nature of the transition period itself, when and even if that will get started, and then what follows it. So today, to discuss what's to come, I'm delighted to introduce four speakers. The first is Kurt Campbell. He is CEO of the Asia Group and serves as the chairman of the board of CNAS. He served as Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, among other positions in government, co-founded CNAS and served as the center's first CEO. And not incidentally, he literally wrote the book on presidential transitions. His volume, Difficult Transitions, Foreign Policy Troubles at the Outset of Presidential Power, was co-authored with Jim Steinberg. And that really dug deeply into the internal and the external challenges that face a newly elected president. Next, we'll have Carrie Cordero, who's the Robert Gates Senior Fellow at CNAS. She previously served at the Department of Justice, at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, among other positions. And she's done extensive work looking at congressional oversight, a particularly interesting angle, given that we may be headed for divided government. Frederick is fellow in our Technology and National Security program. She's looked very closely at the role of new technologies and their use in the hands of autocracies and in democracies, including with respect to elections themselves and the political process. And she previously worked at Facebook and for U.S. Navy Special Warfare Command. And last but certainly not least is Loren Schulman, Adjunct Senior Fellow at CNAS, previously served as our Deputy Director of Studies, as the Leon Panetta Fellow here, and she worked as Senior Advisor to Susan Rice when Dr. Rice was National Security Advisor. She worked at the Pentagon, worked at the NSC, and was involved in the Obama administration's transition back in 2009, but from the inside, dealing with the new team here. So thanks to everybody for joining us. This is going to be, for the audience, live and interactive event. So you're invited to share your comments and your questions, and we'll have a couple of polls here in a while and things like that. If you want to ask a question, you can type it into the chat box below the video player. You could also put it up on Twitter, use hashtag CNAS 2020, and we'll weave these into the conversation. But again, thanks to you for joining us. And Kurt, let me start with you. You know, as I mentioned, this is a transition between two dramatically different presidents, and I think it's safe to say pretty different administrations. What's the sort of overall operational status, the emotional status of the transition efforts on the Biden team right now?
Yeah, great, Richard. And first of all, let me commend you and the whole team at CNAS to have this event to help people understand how critical this period, this transition is, and how many uncertainties there are as we go forward. And it's great to be with Carrie, Kara, and Loren as well. So thank you. So there are many things that are buffeting the transition right now. And remember, this is in many respects the first real transition since the 2010 Transition Act, which you're reading a lot about, where the essential author of that, Senator Kaufman, who replaced Senator Biden when Senator Biden became vice president, his signature initiative was this initiative to help in situations exactly like this. But I think even when he wrote this piece of legislation, he never would have anticipated we would be in this kind of situation. So these are the things that are ongoing right now, Richard. First of all, an incredibly hard week last week. Most of the guys that have been working mostly quietly behind the scenes in the transition are working around the clock for weeks. And so all last week, probably up every night with uncertainty about what's happening and, trying to figure out where is Maricopa County, those things that we didn't know very much about until a few days ago. At the same time, they're operating in an environment that's completely unprecedented. Because of the pandemic, they've had to use technology, Zoom calls and others many of them encrypted, carefully set up, a lot of balkanization, largely because of fear of external penetration, very assertive role that Russians and others have played in previous transitions in trying to, prevent a recurrence of what happened with John Podesta's emails last time. So that's just the beginning. But then on top of that, what becomes clear, just Richard, in the last couple of days, much of the work that was done, really elaborate work about what to expect and kind of rolling out a game plan, try to say this is what we're going to do over the next 2 to 3 to 4 months. Much of that was built on the expectation that the Democrats would win the Senate. And because of that, so much of what they had in mind was for certain kinds of procedural steps that you could be accomplished with, 51 or 52 votes. Richard, you know better than anyone what that's like. That all has to be reevaluated and all has to be rethought. And that's an intense process, and that's underway directly. And then I would just say the last two things that cannot be underestimated. Remember how a campaign runs. There's a campaign structure that basically is spending all their time thinking about winning the election. And these are the senior-most people. They're the people that are with the candidate. And then there is the transition effort, which is laboring away. They brief the campaign, and it is natural. You get briefed a little bit, and you go, yeah, got it. And then you get back to your day job, which is to win the election, right? And then the day that becomes clear, suddenly this whole new group of people, very senior, very seasoned, really, integrate themselves into the transition effort. So there's a massive effort of new personalities, new groups that are involved in what's the most important thing, preparing for government. And then just to add to that, I think all of us understand, probably more than at any time in our recent history, the large number of people that are coming out of the woodwork offering services to help. So you can't open an email without hearing from someone you haven't seen since kindergarten who wants to throw in their hat to help. And that process is overwhelming. So the team right now, I think that's, involved in this very important effort is, laboring intensively with all these, uncertainties and variables, but it's complicated by the fact, and this is the last thing, Richard, really the transition, there is a new legal framework, but it is based essentially on a degree of goodwill. And so everything hinges on really the head of the government service agencies, which we didn't know very much about till a day or two ago, is prepared to sign the document that allows the formal mechanism to kick in. That's monies, resources, and the like. I wouldn't hold my breath. My hope is that it will happen relatively soon. My fear is that it won't.
Yeah, that's great. Loren, let me go to you on this question that Kurt just raised, which, I've, like many other people, have thought more about the GSA in the past 24 hours than probably the past 24 years. They do, I guess, great work in government, but the notion that a presidential transition can't begin until there's a letter signed by a political appointee at GSA, when you have the sitting president who says not only did he not lose, but he actually won, obviously poses certain problems. You wrote about, just a few days ago, an article about how to do good transition. I mean, what kind of gum does this put in the works? One, if this is delayed or just doesn't even happen in terms of a transition team landing and digging in the agencies. And then two, how much difference does it make if it's a week, if it's 2 weeks, if it's 3 weeks?
So let's say the good news first, Richard. First, that despite this hiccup right now, the Trump administration has actually been a pretty good steward of the Presidential Transition Act. Agencies have been preparing for a responsible transition for the past few months in the same way that they did in 2008 and 2016, and in some ways better, given new authorities and new support that they've had over the last 6 months or so. At the same time, the Biden team has one of the most extensive transition apparatus in history. They've been doing their own preparation, their identification of agency review teams, the kind of questions that they'll need to work on and can only work on over the next few months. So even if we are a little late in getting started, we are well ahead of where we have been in the past in 2000 or so. One of the reasons that we have the Presidential Transition Act requirements that are set up today is because, as you'll remember, the 2000 transition was delayed due to ultimately the decision of Bush v. Gore. And as a result, a lot of positions were not filled until late in the Bush administration. There's a lot of speculation that if we'd had more time in that transition for people to be prepared and for personnel to get in place, that you would have had a better prepared team for 9/11. So right now, we've got all that homework that we've done over the past few years has been in place. So I feel good about that. But if we are delayed a few weeks, as you guys have both said, this is the only time that a Biden team has to go in and, without the pressure of governing, to assess where agencies are in terms of their needs, their priorities, their gaps in institutions, as well as the personnel that they may require to have and the talent they may require to have going forward. It's also the only time that they have to do things like team building, to assess where they're going to align their own political appointee talent, as well as think through what are the priorities they want to execute at the beginning. So even in the absence of getting access to agencies, hopefully the Biden team, and I assume they are, is spending the next few weeks focused on the things that they know that they can do. And these are the things that, as I said, they can only do in this time period.
Well, in government agencies, being government agencies, I assume that there stands an enormous stack of memos written by every office in every agency to the transition team, normally saying that their policy or program is sort of the most important, and explaining it and trying to articulate the case for its retention and so forth. But there's a very different thing if you're just in the information absorption and getting briefings and reading memos, or if you have to hit the ground and make decisions and start doing your own things on day one. So it is a potentially major lost opportunity there as well. Let me go to Carrie on this question of divided government. So assume, for the sake of argument and discussion at least, that there is a Republican Senate. You don't need 60 votes to get a nomination through the Senate anymore, but you do need 50, even if the vice president's breaking the tie. And if they're not 50 Democrats, then that certainly would change, I think, the way an incoming administration would think about who it sends up for potentially controversial positions or potentially controversial people. And then you just have how do you actually get things done? There's kind of two ways of looking at this. One is, it's divided government. It'll be gridlocked. The Republicans will have a political incentive to, make the administration fail over 2 years and then run hard against a do-nothing administration in the midterms. On the other hand, if you had to genetically engineer one person who could be better at getting deals through the Congress, it would be harder to think of anybody than Joe Biden. He's got the relationships. He obviously understands the institution. He sort of mentally puts himself in the political position of the people he's dealing with. So, I mean, at this point, what do you expect in terms of what's possible in terms of bipartisan cooperation?
I think there's two sort of periods of time that we need to think about. So one is the post January 20th, which I think is the time that you're referring to, once we have a new Congress in place, once we have the new administration in place, and then the opportunities that might exist for bipartisanship on certain issues. I think there's some issues that I imagine we'll get into, things like China and tech issues, that there are areas for bipartisanship and national security policy making. And then there's other areas, the areas that I have been working a lot on, Homeland Security, where the partisanship has been so corrosive that there's going to be a lot of work to do in order to try to bring some consensus on those issues. But in the immediate future, I'm more concerned about the next 70 plus days and the importance actually of some beginning steps of bipartisanship in this period that we're in right now. As we were just starting this event today, we learned that the president has fired the Secretary of Defense, and we now will have an acting Secretary of Defense through the transition period. Hopefully, Loren is right, and the work that the staffs have been doing in our government agencies and in the transition team have been laying the groundwork for an effective transition. But all indicators are that the president is going to create as much chaos as he can during this period. And so this moment is a moment where, if there are any members of Congress who are looking for an opportunity to pause the corrosive partisanship and bolster the institutions and the ability for this transition can be conducted effectively in a way that shows that our institutions can still function effectively during this transition period, and a way that shows that we really are capable of doing an appropriate transition between administrations. This is the moment for it.
Yeah. I want to come to the tech question that you raised in just a second with Kara, but Kurt, let me go to you first on the China part of this. So, clearly China's watching and has had a very difficult relationship with the Trump administration and vice versa for a whole variety of reasons, including the sort of strategic recasting of China as the strategic competitor of the United States and so forth. How do you see a new team dealing with China, and how do you see Beijing presumably seeking to take advantage of a new team in place in order to reset relations, or at least modify some of the existing competitiveness that's going on?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And I really appreciated the points just made. I think we've seen that, how countries have responded internationally. Some have been fearful or don't want to get ahead in terms of congratulatory calls for fear that there might be a reversal and such. Now, most of those are moving forward. I think one of the only countries that's been very, very careful has been China. Remarkably little careful commentary about hopefully resetting the relationship going forward. I will say, my guess is, Richard, that we're going to find ourselves in a set of circumstances where, because of the divided government, we're going to have to focus on those areas where there is some general common ground. And I think one of those areas revolve around China policy. And I do believe that there are concerns in both parties about a more assertive China that really requires the United States to step up its game. And so I think if you're looking for a rationale for why we're going to need to invest more in education and technology and public-private partnerships, it's going to be to compete more effectively with China. And so I think you're going to see, in many respects, it's going to be the reverse of Vandenberg's famous quote about politics stopping at the water's edge. It's going to be the international issue that is actually going to drive domestic alignment. And I think you're going to see more recognition that there has to be more investment in some of these capacities. As you and I talked the other day, Richard, very much akin to the National Highways Act in 1958. It was sold to the American people that if we needed to get in our cars and get driving in the event of nuclear war. And so that's connected the highway system of the United States. And so I think you're going to see a lot of bipartisan focus on competitiveness and innovation using China as an incentive. The key here is to do that carefully, so that you want to do it in a way that's responsible and that doesn't then lead to demagoguery or the kinds of things that are frankly unproductive, either domestically or internationally. That fine-tuning is one of the most difficult things that you can do, and stand by. My hopes is that we'll be able to do it, but I also believe that one of the only avenues that really might unleash domestic dollars, which is going to matter enormously, will be around this idea of creating more capacity that allows the United States to compete more effectively on the international stage.
Yeah, I think you're totally right about that. And just in the past few days, having a number of conversations with, Republicans on Capitol Hill and otherwise, they seem to see China as the big area of potential bipartisan cooperation between Republicans on the Hill and a Biden administration and Democrats on the Hill, and the ability, as you're sort of getting at, to fold a lot of other things under this China umbrella. So, if you think that something needs to be done on tech policy or on trade agreements or on foreign aid or on innovation or on education or one of these other things on its own, we've shown for 4 years, even though everybody wanted an infrastructure bill, we can't get it done. you got to have some kind of external stimulus to bring the parties together around a common agenda and actually execute it. And China seems to be that. You don't want to stoke McCarthyism and raise the fears of China so much that it's counterproductive domestically, but as an external stimulus to get things done that otherwise couldn't be, I think you're going to see a lot of things cast as China relevant policy initiatives, programs, spending, things like that.
Yeah, Richard, I know you're going to go to other things, but we'll know that this is in play when someone makes the argument that, preschool investments, school lunch, we've got to do this to compete with China. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that.
Exactly. Yeah. Kara, let me go to you, and you've done so much work on technology and its disruptive effects on our democracy, on other democracies, on the elections. Is it right to say that that was kind of the dog that didn't bark in this election? I mean, this election, given how close it would be, would seem to be tailor-made for a malign foreign actor to sort of play around, at a minimum sow dissension, at a maximum put its thumb on the scale a la 2016 when Russia favored one of the two candidates. But at least there hasn't been a lot of reports suggesting that's the case, and maybe part of that is better responses from the United States. So how do you sort of place what just happened, and therefore what priority an administration of the Hill should place on that set of issues going forward?
Yeah, so Richard, if it didn't bite then or bark, thank goodness, because I think you had the public sort of at a heightened sense of vigilance, which is a good thing, right? In August of 2020, there was a Pew survey that actually said 75% of Americans expected some sort of foreign influence in this election. Yeah, it seems like that didn't materialize, but everyone was ready and people were apprised of the threat. So for me, that's a victory, right? We kind of got away with it, I think, at that point. You had the intelligence community warning about Iran, China getting into the game in terms of sowing distrust and dissent, using patriotic netizens to sort of push certain political messaging. So the fact that Americans, the average everyday American was anticipating that, I think is a win. 75% is a huge number when it comes to being aware of what actually happens on digital platforms. In terms of prioritizing that, I think Carrie alluded to this earlier, and it's really interesting, these surprising areas of bipartisanship that have already materialized so far in the past few months, even years. That's number one, big tech probably needs to be regulated in some degree, and number two, China. But focusing on the tech point and bringing it back to your question is this idea of content moderation. We're gonna probably see Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 sort of get tweaked in some way. And that is one thing, both parties, they're sort of coming at it from different angles and for different reasons, but it's sort of under that content moderation bucket. Democrats think big tech companies need to do more about things like disinformation on the platform. Republicans think there needs to be less that's done. But I really think you're going to expect to see more of the Section 230 in the crosshairs, that kind of real energy behind potentially regulating these, what people call big tech platforms.
And Kurt, this obviously this tech question is caught up in what everyone now refers to as great power competition, and it's hard to put our minds back 4 years ago when no official government document described China as a strategic competitor. Great power competition wasn't the buzzword. It didn't have its own acronym, and it was a more careful calibration of various U.S. foreign policy interests and so forth. And then along comes the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, but say, no, great power competition is the top priority, China first, then Russia, and then you've got these other priorities, whether it's Iran, North Korea, continuing counterterrorism operations in the greater Middle East and so forth. I mean, do you see the new administration fundamentally reprioritizing that sort of slate of issues with a new approach, or do you think that they'll sort of build on what the Trump administration has put in place, even though it was an administration of very different type?
Yeah, I think there are clearly going to be elements of continuity. Whether those will be acknowledged right off the bat, it's not clear. But there are also going to be some areas. I'm confident that there are people around the president-elect that believe that there are essential areas, existential areas that require some degree of effort on the part of the United States to reach out to China, whether that's on climate change or on the tail end of the pandemic, on vaccinating the world, working jointly in some areas potentially, and not necessarily just bilaterally, but in a larger context. And then also on proliferation, there's going to have to be some more communication with respect to North Korea. Those are clearly areas that I would expect to see going forward. But at the same time, Richard, I think that the lion's share of the focus at the outset is going to be more intent efforts to try to bridge and work closely with allies and friends about shared challenges. And I think the biggest shared challenge is how to deal with an emerging China in a number of areas, technology, as Kara's very effectively pointed out, in which the interests are not always aligned, and to try to present some sort of united front to dissuade China from taking destabilizing steps either on the national security side or on human rights or the like. Already we've seen so many things that are troubling. I think the harder thing, though, Richard, if I can say, I think at core it has been a tendency for the national security elite to somehow hearken back. It's natural to the Cold War as the appropriate framework of how to think about the United States and China. And so the tendency is to think primarily as a military competition. There is a military dimension undeniably, but the primary areas of competition going forward are in things that CNAS has written a lot about, and you've got an excellent team. It's AI, 5G, quantum computing, life sciences, robotics. You go down that list. And in fact, most of the people that work on the U.S. China relationship do not have an expertise in those areas, really, and couldn't define precisely what the parameters are, what are areas that we would want to exclude China and bring in other partners, what are areas would we be comfortable potentially working together. We are at the very beginning stages of trying to figure out how to construct a new relationship with China that will be based largely on competition. We'll have areas of decoupling and hopefully some areas where we can potentially work together. And the watchword is stable competition, but that's easier talked about than actually achieved.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, great. We're going to move to some audience questions now, but before we do, Shai Corman, our Director of Communications, has got some poll questions. And so, Shai, if you can fire up the first one.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. By the way, we have literally hundreds of people watching right now. So in the spirit of elections, in the spirits of voting, we would love for you to participate. We're going to put our first poll up right now, and this is going to be about the first 30 days of the Biden-Harris administration. You should see the poll appearing in the chat bar, and you will see it appear at the bottom of the screen right now. Here, or actually right over my face, you're going to see it. And this is, pandemic aside, what should the Biden-Harris administration's top national security priority be in the first 30 days? And your options are outreach to allies, which already has votes, competition with China, Iran, and North Korea. And of course, if you have another, you should absolutely drop that in the chat, and we will get to it in a little bit when we come back to the results. Back to you, Richard.
All right, thanks. So we'll get the results here in a minute. Let me take a couple of questions from the audience. And Loren, maybe I can pitch this first one to you. Thoughts on NATO? Do we expect Obama 2.0, or will this be different? I'm not sure what Obama 2.0 would look like, so feel free to define that in the course of your thoughts. Loren? Oh, there she is.
Nope, I'm here.
Did you get the question?
I did. Yeah, no, I'm good. So I think no question in my mind that Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, will spend a lot of time focusing on allies. I think throughout the campaign, he and many of his other competitors in the Democratic primary, their foreign policy stance could be summed up as several other priorities bracketed by allies and partners, always mentioning the need to rebuild our relationships with them. And it's a core tenet of his foreign policy agenda that he's put forward from day one. I think that we are going to have a challenging, we'll have a challenging first 6 months, first year or so of the Biden administration to think through exactly how to do so. Showing up will be a big part of it, but it's not only going to be showing up. I think that if we do have a divided government and a particularly Republican Senate, many of our allies will wonder how effective we will be able to be in making commitments and following up on commitments, given that it's entirely likely that a Republican Congress will make it very challenging for a President Biden to pursue his foreign policy agenda effectively. Fortunately, NATO is something that has a lot of bipartisan support. This is something where if we decided to reverse some of the decisions to pull out our troops from NATO countries, if we decided to engage them more actively in thinking through what NATO should be and developed around 21st century challenges, I think you'd have a lot of members of Congress who would be supportive of that. The question is whether or not they will be reacting against a Biden agenda, or Republican Senate would be reacting against a Biden agenda as they have shown to be in the past under President Obama. In terms of what's Obama 2.0 or anything else, I think the Obama relationship with NATO itself changed over the course of his administration. So we'll be at Biden-Harris 1.0, and we'll define what that is as we go.
Great. Shai, do we have results from our poll?
We do have results from our poll, and overwhelmingly, outreach to allies has 77% of the vote, competition with China 20% of the vote, nothing on Iran, and one little vote for North Korea. And so it seems that, and allies, the numbers keep going up. And so it seems that allies is really taking the lead here. And can't say I'm surprised based on our discussion that we're having.
Richard, can I just, I'm sorry, Loren, just one thing on that. It's an easy, I like the way Loren said it. Everyone highlighted this is what they're going to do. But Richard, you've done it. Many of the people on this call have also done it. The actual act of deep diplomacy with allies is extremely challenging. It's not a throwaway. It's hard because allies have views, they state them, and we're not in an environment where the United States can say, look, this is how we're going to do this, sort of our way or the highway. And I think there's probably, first of all, quite a lot of pent-up anxiety, which frankly, you don't want to unleash on President Trump because you never know what he would do. I think the incoming Biden team is going to hear a lot of unhappiness with the expectation that he and his team will handle it responsibly, i.e. just sort of suck it up. But it won't be easy. I think, secondly, I think we're going to have to be humble, a lot of listening. And those are not often American strong suits, to be honest. And so we could maybe do it for a little bit, but it's hard to do it for a long time. And we'll see, that really, kind of pivots on the quality of the diplomats. And on, these guys have strong views. And one of the first things that they're going to ask us about is what's our trade policy, for instance. And that's a hard thing to have an answer for right now. And so even though it's top of mind, it is the right thing to do, but that process will be more challenging than almost anything we do. And remember, when it comes to China policy, what China can do better than any country I've ever worked with, Richard, if they see a forming group of countries arrayed against them, they will split those countries. They will find divisions among them, like a guy cutting a cord of wood. They're very effective at blocking efforts that are meant to jointly constrain or present challenges to them. So get ready. We're heading into a period of much more complex, essential, but much more complex alliance politics.
Just one more point on Kurt's discussion there is that I think that if we could make the Munich Security Conference next year into just like a Festivus airing of grievances amongst the allies, the Biden administration might be better off, as you say, Kurt, just to let everybody get it off their chests. We're going to have months of this, so might as well just like make an event out of it in some ways. But so much of the Biden agenda is wrapped up around things that we want to do with partners. Climate change, pandemic, these are not things we could do ourselves. These are the areas where under the Trump administrations, we've fallen so far behind of where we should be. So I think that it's absolutely vital, but at the same time, as Kurt says, it's going to take a while to build back the trust necessary.
There is, however, another difficulty, which is, the disinclination of allies to do some of the things the United States would like them to do is only partially related to our disposition toward them, right? I mean, if you go from kind of meanie, irresponsible, erratic, Donald Trump on alliances to nice guy, consistent, reassuring Joe Biden, it still doesn't take care of everything, right? Yeah. Because, and in fact, if you go too far, then you can encourage some free riding with allies that think no matter what they do, nice guy, Biden administration, reassuring, consistent Biden administration will be there. So I think you want to reassure and be consistent, but not too much, not so much that that you don't draw out a greater willingness to actually work with the United States. I mean, you don't have to go into the bashing and the undermining that Trump did, but there's been a reason why, for example, defense secretaries have railed at the Europeans on their defense spending for 40 years, right? And without a whole lot to show for it for a long time. So anyway,
can I add one other thing, Richard? I'm sorry, I want to make sure Carrie and others, everyone else gets in this. But I had this experience yesterday that I'm sure others can relate to. I guess it was Saturday morning before the election was called. Very early morning. I like to ride my bike, normally go down to Old Town. I rode into Washington, D.C., and rode by all the monument, all the, downtown area. First of all, just huge numbers of homeless people, barbed wire, everything was boarded up, fences. It really looked like Berlin at the end of the Cold War. And I think it's going to be hard. I think it's going to be hard to have an agenda about, hey, listen to us about, perfecting democracy or human rights, given what we are experiencing. It's not what we experienced. It's what we're experiencing and what we're going through. And I think a lot of countries are going to be, hey, focus on yourself right now, as opposed to, transitioning and translating that into some sort of, return to promulgating American values. I'm all for it. And I think that is who we are, Richard, as a people and as a nation. But I think there's going to be more a sense of a country that has been wounded and domestically challenged than we recognize.
Carrie, let me go to you. I know you got a comment on allies, and maybe you can also touch on this. What is America's sort of moral standing or standing on some of these values issues, especially with administration coming in that wants to make democracy and human rights a bigger part of its foreign policy agenda than the current one?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think you read my mind, Richard. I do want to follow up on this concept of reinvigorating our relationship with allies, though, because I think there's going to be a big uncertainty that the incoming Biden-Harris administration is going to have to deal with. And that is the fact is that the Trump administration's conduct of foreign policy, the way that they have used the State Department versus the way that they have used a very small cadre of individuals close to the president, including his family members, for conducting foreign policy issues and negotiations and policy making, is going to leave a lot of uncertainty about what actually have been the conversations and the interactions between the White House and foreign partners, allies, and countries that maybe traditionally those in this group might consider adversaries, or certainly countries that have far adverse interests to our own and far different value systems than our own. So, and the way that they incorporate human rights and respect for privacy and civil liberties into their foreign policy making. So I think there's going to be a bit of uncertainty. And one question that I have as someone coming from an intelligence community background is to what extent has there been some degree of our traditional allies holding back a little bit on us, particularly perhaps in the last year or two. I think there will be a period of unwinding that the intelligence community and the new State Department leadership will need to do to try to get to the ground truth of what exactly our allies, how they view the current landscape of national security threats. That piece of what are the actual threats is something that we have been so domestically focused for the last year that we didn't even have a worldwide threat briefing from the intelligence community to the Congress and to the American public this year. And so that regeneration of actually having a more transparent picture, both for the incoming administration and for the American public as well, about what the current status of national security threats are, I think is really going to be something that will be on the horizon very soon. On your question, just quickly on to look at your question, Richard, regarding a values-based foreign policy, this is something that that I think for many of us on a bipartisan basis have found lacking in the current administration's foreign policy. That traditionally there has been a values-based, human rights conscious foreign policy for America, and there might be disagreements on the margins about what that means, but there has been a fundamental commitment to that. The Trump administration foreign policy, from my perspective, has been very transactional, at times overtly based on monetary compensation and a transactional nature. And I think one of the things that hopefully there will be able to be some future bipartisan consensus on is reintroducing that human rights-based, value-based foreign policy into our appearance in the world.
Yeah, I can't resist offering a quick comment on this. I just hope that the new administration doesn't wait for American consistency to march out on a values-infused foreign policy. I mean, you know, the United States, both in its foreign policy and in its promotion of democracy and human rights abroad, as compared to its domestic practice, has always been a bundle of contradictions. I mean, John F. Kennedy promised to bear any burden and pay any price in defense of liberty, while African Americans couldn't vote in his own country in the South. You know, Jimmy Carter came in and said, human rights will be my top foreign policy priority. And then he clinked glasses with the Shah of Iran and described him as an island of stability. I mean, Jimmy Carter. And, you know, you can go through almost every administration. And of course, the autocracies of the world love to point out the inconsistency or the hypocrisy, as they would say. But, you know, intellectual consistency is not the highest good in foreign policy, and it's not often achievable. And so if we're going to wait around to sort of perfect ourselves before we start to urge others to get better, then I think we would be in error. I know that's not what you're proposing, but I do hear that sometimes. Shai, do we have another polling question we can put up for the?
We do have another polling question, and this one has to do with bipartisanship. And here we go. The poll, it's now open. It's in the chat. If you're looking in the chat box, or if you pop out the chat box, you can see, again, thank you to the hundreds of people who have been voting and chatting and who are playing along at home. The new question is now open, and it is: given the prospect of divided government, how optimistic are you about bipartisan cooperation on national security? Already some votes coming in for not very optimistic. In the meantime, I'd love to put that back to our panel here.
Let me, just as we're waiting for votes to come in, let me go to Kara real quickly on two specific questions. One is from our audience, and they ask, essentially, will the Biden administration keep or scrap the Space Force? So maybe you can change that to should, so that it's not just a prediction. But I actually have another question about, you know, it seems wrong to me to think that this 4-year period of Donald Trump in power was like a meteor that hit the Earth and now it's gone, and it had nothing to do with us. It just kind of came from outer space or something. But in fact, it was a product of very deep and widespread political sentiment, as expressed last week by not quite, but almost enough Americans to get him reelected. And so when you look at the stuff we're talking about, whether it's trade or some of the other things too, trade, immigration, you know, the forever wars that we haven't yet talked about, the so-called forever wars, I mean, where do you think, does that strain of more kind of nationalist populism, does that just sort of wither on the vine now that the champion for it exits to some degree the political scene? Or, how much of this is going to keep going and essentially define a lot of the Republican foreign policy agenda?
So Richard, no, I don't think it withers on the vine. And I think you've seen sort of the popularity and the really meteoric rise of some of these legislatures like Senator Josh Hawley, Dan Crenshaw, Sass is sort of Senator Ben Sass is a different case. But, you're talking about 70 million people who voted for something different. And the, Republicans potentially holding the Senate pending the Georgia runoffs, I think it does say that, yeah, there is something to what you're calling sort of this populist agenda. I think people are unwilling to let it go. Yes, Trump himself, he gathered a lot of people to his personality, for good or for ill. He was very transactional, as Carrie said, and personality driven. But I think some of these ideas are going to endure at least for the next 4 years and probably after that. And I don't think we can sort of discount the fact that, hey, we think, some half of America thinks that they should lean into that competitive advantage that is so distinct to what China is offering. You're talking about the rule of law. You're talking about redress when certain, data guzzling practices prove too overbearing. Look at what Apple did when the FBI asked for information after the San Bernardino shooting. So there are, huge contrast, I think, that America, as a good system, has to offer when put up against the encroaching liberalism of places like China. And I think what the Trump administration did do very well was highlight the difference between the two systems of governance, the difference between the legal atmosphere, the digital environment. And there's so much more that I think, as Kurt said, the elements of continuity can sort of move forward here. Offering an alternative is something I think the next administration should really emphasize. We should basically say, hey, America needs to do some things better when it comes to digital privacy, but we need to offer something attractive to the rest of the world. So yeah, you are maintaining elements of a transactional nature, but you're also offering something good, something that freedom lovers around the globe can sort of gather to, not just Donald Trump, but what America represents. I still think we are that shining city on a hill, and I think if we use things like technology, like discovering a privacy solution, having the best products that are going to, keep your data, keep your content safe from authoritarians, doing that, making sure that these giving and sharing of technology between now Hong Kong dissidents that are vetted, between Taiwan, that those things can sort of, flower is something that I think the next administration can do, and that the Trump administration really did start, as well as imposing costs on tech-enabled human rights abuses. You saw the reintroduction of the Magnitsky Act against individuals in particular. So sort of leaning into those alternatives, those sort of free world good things that we're propagating, I think is something that could provide the Biden administration with an opportunity to sort of keep going and keep that legacy alive, Trump or no Trump.
Great. Shai, what does the poll look like?
So the poll, there's at first a lot of not very optimistics came pouring in, but then somewhat optimistic edged the other options out with 59% of the vote, and only a few people saying no chance, but nobody saying very optimistic. Very interested to know what the rest of the panel has to say about that.
And you're willing to accept the mail-in late ballots for somewhat optimistic without requiring that they be eliminated so that not very optimistic wins?
We are counting all of the votes.
Kurt, I know I want to get because I know you have a view on this, but I also wanted to ask you, this impulse that has given rise on the Republican side to populism, nationalism, Trumpism, whatever, obviously exists on the Democratic side and of course across both parties. And, it seems like there's a patent sense among a pretty big portion of the electorate that globalization just hasn't worked out very well for them, that trade agreements haven't benefited them, that immigration hasn't benefited them, both legal and illegal, that climate change policy is a threat potentially to their jobs, the forever wars, they disproportionately send their sons and daughters to fight them. It sort of serves an elite. And that's easy to say, well, a new foreign policy will address all of that. You know, we've got it now. But how do you think a Biden administration will take on this big portion of the population that just seems dissatisfied with the traditional post-Cold War direction of our foreign policy?
Yeah, look, you know, Richard, what you basically encapsulated there was just the unbelievable challenge that Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, and his team are going to have to deal with, which are just, you know, unprecedented challenges that in many respects I think are more daunting even than those that Roosevelt took on in his first term, across the board, domestically, internationally, and the like. And I do believe, you know, I often hear people say we've got to repackage and explain clearly, talk louder, slower about why trade is good, you know, use American force more judiciously and the like. I do think we're probably entering a period, the first phase of a period in which a major relook about America's larger role in the world is in the offing. I don't think we can expect, Richard, any one administration to be able to answer all of those questions. And I don't think ultimately it's simply led from the executive branch. I think this is going to be a national debate along the lines the other speakers have underscored. And that process, I think, will begin. It's already begun, but I think will flourish more directly. I have to also say the one thing that we have not really discussed that kind of lurks in all of this conversation is whether we're experiencing American decline. And that's something that, you know, we really can't talk about very much domestically, because it's admit defeat, and Americans have faced this before, and we faced it down, and we came surging back. But I can assure you, in the halls of power, in boardrooms around the world, the quiet conversation is about whether the United States is slipping on the global stage. And so the enormous challenge of this, and probably the next administration, is to summon American will, power, cunning to make an argument that the United States still can and should and will play a leading role, that we have the national incentive and will to play that role across the board, and that we understand that Pax Americana has been good for us and good for the world as a whole. And so it's not just to reform the nature of the domestic consensus, which in itself will be very challenging, Richard, as you rightly point out, but it will also be to make the case internationally that we're still up for the challenge. Now, we faced difficulties before, during Vietnam, at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the global economic crisis. Each time, many countries either feared or some hoped that we were down and out. And each time we did come roaring back through innovation, through a whole host of things. And the hope is that we'll be able to call on some of those inherent, innate strengths to be able to not only make that case internationally, but to conquer some of our divisions domestically. But it would be very difficult to overestimate the nature of the challenge.
Shai, I think we have one last poll question that we can put up. Is that right?
We do. We got one last poll question.
Spin it, DJ Shai. That's what
exactly. This is I'm trying to, like I said, I'm trying to embody Scooter from the Muppets. If anybody gets that reference. We have one last poll. We started our polls looking at the immediate, at the first 30 days. In our third poll, we're going to look a couple of years out. So we're going to come back to those same answers from the first poll, but frame it differently. And it's going to be and we're going to open the poll right now. It is available in the chat. What will the Biden-Harris administration's top national security priority be? National policy priority be, should be national security policy priority be in 2022. Okay, what will the Biden-Harris administration's top national security policy priority be in 2022? Looking around the corner, if allies took the game in the first question, What will it be in a couple of years?
All right. Well, while people are voting on that, let me go to Loren quickly for a question that I know is near and dear to your heart. And you wrote about this the other day on National Security Council staff and what the structure and process should look like. And you have a line in there that I'm paraphrasing, but I love, that the answer to the question, what kind of national security staff do you want? The correct answer is always Brent Scowcroft. Everybody wants the Scowcroft model and says that, but it doesn't explain anything. And I mean, I can remember working on the NSC staff in the Bush administration, and it was about 120 people, and everybody was complaining then it was way too big because Scowcroft never kept it, never had it over 80. By the Obama administration, I think it was over 400. Then it's shrunk down. I mean, what's the optimal here, and what does the next team need to do, but on that kind of structure, but also in terms of this process of oscillating back and forth between a highly centralized policymaking process in the White House and one that's much more distributed in terms of authority to the agencies, that we've now seen manifestations of kind of almost both extremes over the past few years.
I mean, the best process for them to have, Richard, is the one that President President-elect Biden chooses, the one that he actually is going to use, going to stick with, and the one that does not create informal behind-the-scenes policy processes or second-line tracks or track 2 dialogue within the White House that people are using that is outside the normal process. As you said, like everybody always wants to say Scowcroft model. That's the way we're going to run our NSC because it sounds like the best possible one. Well, if it's not how the president wants to run his process, then it's the worst possible one because you're just doubling everybody's time and wasting everybody's energy on a policy development that is going to be either circumvented or overruled by the National Security Advisor, the White House, or the president himself. I think that the choices they've got to make in that area are, where does the president and the vice president feel comfortable delegating? Are there areas that are really, really important to them that they want to keep close to the vest? And I would argue that if, COVID's got to be one, innovation, technology policy's got to be another, climate change has got to be another, that they absolutely require central management in the executive office of the president, if only because they cut across so many agencies that delegating to an agency is not going to work. On the other hand, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not policymaking and operationalization of policy has been too concentrated within the National Security Council staff. And can that be moved, at least in part, back to the State Department, who had this role or was meant to have this role since its formation? The challenge on that side, though, is that so many departments and agencies are either underfunded, understaffed, or underled, or poorly managed, and not necessarily ready to take on the kind of management authority and responsibility that we would like them to if we wanted a more decentralized process. The Biden administration, in looking at these decisions, also has to think through how do they build up the career staff, put in place the kinds of senior leaders, senior political appointees who bring not only the expertise, but the management chops in order to run their institutions, and also think through how they work together as a team. If you're just putting together the best possible runner at the top of every agency and not thinking through how they collaborate together, or even if they even want to collaborate together, you're only making half the decisions that you need to. And this is to come back to our first question. This is the only time they get to actually think through these issues. Once you start at the beginning of an administration and start working through these habits of who's in what meeting and how long it goes and what topics it's on, what memos goes to the president and what's just go to a DASD at the Department of Defense, those habits get set right away. And it's so hard to make any changes later when somebody says, this is messed up, we should do this differently.
Great. We're almost out of time, so let's go to the poll, and then I'll ask Carrie and Kurt one final question, and then we can let everyone go back to their day.
All right, here we go. The results are a little different this time. Maybe not surprising. Outreach to allies still has a lot of fans, but competition with China looking 2 years out, 72%, with a few votes here and there for Iran and a few votes for North Korea.
There's one North Korean viewer out there who's really pressing that button over and over again, and he's just not making a lot of headway, but he keeps showing up in the results. So, great. All right, let me go to Carrie, and then we'll give Kurt kind of the final word on this. And I'd be interested in your answer to the question that was just given in the poll. But also, if there's one thing that the new administration should make sure to do in the first 100 days, leaving aside COVID and go after it and all that stuff. So let's leave that aside. But what is kind of on the foreign policy, national security agenda? What's kind of the one thing that you would recommend that the new administration try to make sure to do in the first 100 days or so? So let me go to Carrie, and then we'll finish up with Kurt.
All right, so coronavirus obviously is a big set aside, because that really is going to be the priority in the first 100 days, is to get the worldwide pandemic under control, get it under control in the United States, and also start to develop a more productive international global effort to get it under control worldwide as we start to see another wave go through Europe and other parts of the world. Beyond that, I think the aspiration is what Kurt was starting to describe, which is starting to define what is the 21st century American role in the world in a way that we don't define it as the post-World War II framework. And so I think I think that would be the longer term big picture objective of the Biden-Harris administration. However, my big caveat for that, in particular as someone who focuses a lot on the domestic national security, homeland security picture, is if we can get to that, that will be a luxury. Because what might happen in the meantime is we still have to deal with this growing domestic terrorism threat, this growing white supremacist, extremist agitator community that has a louder voice and a more robust willingness to show their face and be public and engage in agitating activity here in the United States, or some other external actor that imposes a crisis that maybe has been holding off for a little while, in part due to the sort of volatility of how a Trump administration would respond, but an external national security threat that has been a little bit under the radar, but that shows itself in the first year or so of the next administration. So I think to sort of cap on the domestic front and the homeland security front, one thing that I hope to address this domestic issue that we really have to deal with in a more concerted way is I hope as the incoming transition team is developing their plans for the beginning of the administration, that they take the homeland security and the leadership of the homeland security and putting those steps in place as seriously and on par with the effort that they're going to put into State Department and that they're going to put into the Defense Department and the other traditional national security spaces, because those issues and attention to the domestic security picture, I hope they will put on par and an equal footing and attention to rebuilding.
Great. Kurt.
Yeah, thanks. What a great discussion. It's so good to hear all these voices. I've actually learned a lot today just listening. I would just leave with one thing, Richard. I think we have a tendency to think of the pandemic and how we will deal with it as a 2021 problem. But I think there's a very good chance that it stretches on beyond that. And, most of what we're hearing about its spread, its embeddedness, and the challenges of the potential evolution, and whether humans will have built up immunity after a vaccine, we just don't know. And just a few things going wrong could leave us in a situation that this becomes the dominant issue that we have to address for years. And I wouldn't underestimate that, Richard, honestly. And, we take for granted that we have, 100,000 new cases, could be 200,000 cases a day new in the next couple of weeks. And just, day after day of over 1,000 or more deaths in the United States. This process plays out just a little bit longer and starts to increase. I think we will be headed into a much greater challenge than we realize, and the international dimensions of it we haven't even begun to think about. So if you ask me to nominate my number one case, I'm surprised that the coronavirus and its kind of next stages did not get a vote in DJ Shai's overview about what to expect in the years ahead. Great.
That's a great caution. And it is amazing if you step back and think at any point in our careers, if someone had said, what is a international event that would require almost all Americans to stay home for a year, that would infect 100,000 or so a day, that would kill, so many of our fellow countrymen and also be spreading around the world, it would be hard. to think of something as consequential as what we're living through right now, and that's sure to scope and shape everything that's headed as we go forward. So thank you, all four of you, for joining us today. Really appreciate this. Thank you for the audience. This obviously was a kind of a pop-up event that we announced not too long ago, but really appreciate everybody who was able to take the time to join us. You'll see more from CNAS on all of the issues that we talked about today and more on the process and the personalities and the dynamics of this new era that we're headed into. So watch out for that. And thanks to everybody for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.